All right, this is the last video in the series going over some basics of Azure policies. I've referenced this video a couple of times because this is the video where we're going to be getting slightly into the more advanced topics without going full-blown, really difficult, challenging material. We're going to be getting into talking about some of the actual Azure policy structure itself, as in how they're written and how you can kind of interpret it, because you are going to need to understand it. Some of the topics we'll talk about here. I'm going to take a look quickly at some of the predefined initiatives. Initiatives, there's not much to writing them, but there's a couple elements that make them unique. So we'll take a look at what exists and talk about kind of the way those are structured, and then we'll take a little bit closer look at the policy definition structures themselves. This is how the policies are written in JSON and the different elements and what's important for you to know and understand and what's not so important from a basics perspective. Finally, we are going to actually create a custom policy so that you can see what that process looks like and what the elements are involved in. And then once we've done that and we've seen kind of a whole bunch of different pieces that go into it, I'm going to talk about why managing policy with code is the way to go, especially when you get into creating custom policies, because it makes the whole process way smoother. So let's go ahead and jump into that. Going back to our portal here, I've gotten my my view all messed up. Let's see if I can fix this. There we go. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is initiatives. We're going to touch on this really briefly because there's not a lot to them. They're basically just another layer on top of definitions. But as a reminder, initiatives are collections of individual policy definitions that you can then apply or assign as a single object versus needing to assign 100 different definitions. So it's basically a group of policies. There are a few that come by default, and we mentioned this in my Security Center video or my Defender for Cloud video. But one of the ones that comes by default is this ASC default policy initiative. And if I click into this, it's going to show you a couple of elements that are good to know. So right here, you've got a whole bunch of policies. It shows compliance. This is never going to be good because this is kind of an overall what you hope to achieve from a security standpoint. But the parts I want to call out specifically are in an initiative assignment, you've got 3 columns or categories that you can view in. The first, and the thing that makes initiatives unique, are what are called groups. When you create an initiative, you organize your individual policies into groups. And groups are a way that you are filtering the view of that initiative for the people who are looking at it to better understand what that policy is doing and how the policies work. So as an example, if we look through some of these groups, all of the policy objects that are related to enabling threat detection capabilities are in this group. And that it's the group name is what those policies are intended for. Otherwise, they've got a group for discover, classify, and label sensitive data. Use strong authentication controls. If I click into this, I believe it tells you the actual policies that are associated with that group. So this ASC default policy is a little different because it's got a little bit more definition than you'd normally see in an initiative. But if I click on this group and I go to policies, this tells me the actual policy objects that are associated with that group. And this is really the group's mechanism for initiatives is really designed to make it easier to understand what that initiative is doing and break it down a little bit more clearly. And so you can see the group is use strong authentication controls. I was reading the subtitle there. And then this is talking about policies related to MFA being enabled or requiring SSH keys. Strong authentication related policy objects, right? So if I go back to this assignment, the other 2 columns here, you've got the individual policies themselves. And it's also worth noting is when you're writing an initiative, you can put a single policy into multiple groups. So this storage accounts should use private link, could be in a group for storage accounts, and then could also be another group for require private link. if you wanted to. It really comes down to the initiative writer, how they want to structure it and how they want to organize the policy objects. And then last but not least, you got a list of the actual resources themselves that aren't compliant for whatever reason. So that's a view of initiatives. The other thing that I was going to call out before I go on to some of the more policy specific things is Azure comes with a whole bunch of security benchmark policies or initiatives written for you. So I believe SOC 2 is one. SOC 2 Type 2, you've got a whole initiative. Another one that's really popular is NIST. If I want to do NIST 853, I can click into this initiative, and just like the ASC default, there's groups that tell you what the different requirements it's trying to accomplish are, and then it's got the policy objects itself that are listed that initiative. And if I want to assign it, there's a whole bunch of parameters that I can specify. A lot of these have default values, so I don't need to, but I just want to call out the fact that if you're looking for a specific security benchmark and you don't want to go through the effort of writing your own policies, you can either apply one of these existing built-in initiatives that Microsoft manages, or you could duplicate it, modify it for the policies that are important to you, and then go from there, and then you're starting from a baseline versus building up from scratch. Okay, that's all I really want to talk about for initiatives. So let's get a little bit further into the definitions themselves. I've talked about this example a couple of times, but for our policy example here, we're going to focus on two policies. This one saying that storage account should have a minimum TLS version, and the second one saying configure secure transfer of data on a storage account. Okay, if I open this policy, you can do this on any definition. It shows you the actual policy definition down here. All of this JSON is, let me get to the top here, is the actual policy definition itself. So if you were going to write your own policy object, this is what it would look like from just a strictly code perspective. Now, it's got other summary information up here, like the effects on this one are audit, which isn't actually accurate because the effects are audit, deny, or disabled. That's an important distinction, but it lists that. So this got summary stuff up here, but it's better. You're going to get better and more accurate information if you're looking at the actual policy definition itself. Now, if I want to see what this is checking for, if you remember back to the first video where we talked about the Azure platform and how every single object in Azure is represented by JSON attributes. There's a JSON object representation for that resource. So let me go over here, and I'm going to pull up the Azure portal and go to my lab resource group. If I pull up this storage account, I can see all of the properties of this resource, right? For the sake of this demonstration, what I'm actually going to do, let me copy this into another notepad, and I'm going to pull this up here. One second. Switch views here. Let's do this. Okay, so I save my browser here. I've got my storage account attributes here. This is my copy and paste of that storage accounts. Now, the policy itself, you've got its parameters. Oftentimes, this information up here maps to the friendly information that's across the top here. So you can kind of gloss over this. Parameters are important only because this always contains your effects, which are good to know. And then it also tells you what setting it's going to enforce by default. In this case, the policy is to specify the minimum allowed TLS version, and that's also a parameter that's specified here, and the default value is TLS 1.2. So if you assign this policy by default as is with no modifications, it will enforce a minimum version of TLS 1.2 because that's the way the parameters are set up. A default value means it will use this unless you specify otherwise. Now if I collapse this parameters thing, the policy rule is where you get into the meat of everything. And this is where it maps directly back to those JSON values of the object. So the first thing it checks for is what resources it needs to evaluate. So this type is the type of resource, and right here you've got Microsoft storage account. If I go back and look at my JSON value here, I can see right here the type of this resource is storage accounts. So that's how it's checking. So the first check, yes, it does match the storage account, meaning this policy will apply to storage accounts. And then the type is pretty much common on every single resource definition, and then the following defines the actual properties that this policy is checking for. So in this case, it's checking for two. One, it's this property called minimum TLS version, and it says it's not equal to 1.2 in this case because that's the default. The other thing it checks for is whether this property, the same one, minimum TLS version, exists. And the reason this is written this way is some resources, unless that property is defined, it sets it to a default value which might not match. So setting this to exists false, meaning if that property doesn't exist in the JSON object, then we're going to assume that resource is non-compliant, meaning I want the policy to specifically check for and make sure that that property is there. Now let's go back to my JSON object just to compare. For this, you've got a lot of the default values here for the object, right? You've got the SKU, this is a local redundant storage, you've got the type, you have the ID and the name, but the properties are usually what Azure Policy actually wants to check for. And on here, if I copy this and go over here and then search for it, search bar's right here, I can see this is the property that it's actually checking for. And you'll see in this case, the property is actually TLS 1.2. Now, that's because I ran through this earlier and I was supposed to set this to TLS 1.0. I might just go back and change this really quick so we can get a good demo here. So let's just do that. But I'm going to change this thing, finish my thought. 1 second. Do this, configuration 1.0, save. I want this to be out of compliance. Alright, so I already have a policy. So I'm going to fix this in a second. We'll transition the video and then come back and pick up in a second here. Okay. So that's how policy evaluates, and this is at a high level the important thing to note from a sense of evaluating policies and how they're going to check. Any policy that's written, if it's failing compliance, that's how you evaluate. Come in here, look at the type to make sure it's checking the same storage type, and then look at these if rules to see whether it's compliant or not. For any audit, deny, audit if not exist policy, anything that's just checking for a setting to be a certain way and then blocking it or marking it as not compliant if it doesn't meet that, it's only really going to have if for the policy rule itself. And then the then is just going to be the effect. So if you think about the policy effect being deny, I want to block this if it doesn't meet it. It means if this minimum TLS version is not 1.2, then deny, because that's the effect I specified here. Block it from existing. So audit policies, deny policies are very, very simple in how they apply and how they're written, and it's easy to see what it's actually checking for. So let's go and create an assignment for this and actually enforce it. So I'll put it in my lab scope. Oops. Select, set that enabled. I don't really care about this. For the parameters, this is where I was saying, if I don't change this, these are the default values for this, and the only change here is I'm going to change the effect to deny because I want it to block me to create storage accounts if it doesn't exist. And the TLS version, sure, I'm okay requiring TLS 1.2. Remediation we're going to talk about in a little while, but I just want to point out here for a second that where does it say this? Okay, yeah, right here. This policy does not contain any role definitions, and policies must specify role definitions in order to create the correct role assignments for managed identity. It also talks about how it doesn't really work on deny or audit policies. So I'll talk about that more when we get into configuring our own custom policy. The last thing we'll set here is this is the message you get if the policy is to block resources from being created, you want to make sure this is set for deny policies so that users know why they're being blocked. Otherwise, it's just going to say it's disallowed by policy and that's it. And then it's going to be up to them to guess and figure out what's going on here. So that's it. We've created that assignment. So now let's switch back to our resource group here and attempt to create one. Now this doesn't really matter. As you can probably tell, it's not going to work. So random letters. Set this to LRS, so I'm not paying for anything. In advanced, let's try setting this to 1.0 and go to review. And this is not working because I had a policy applied earlier that blocked the resource type from being created. That was created in the last video, and it looks like even though I've deleted that assignment, it's still preventing me. So I'm going to cut out here, and we'll come back and finish recording this video. Oh, okay, there we go. That's what we wanted. All right, sorry. There is some delay, and this is worth noting for policy. If you're working with policies, there's definitely delay when you're creating, editing, deleting, modifying, where sometimes you have screwy issues like this, where even though I had deleted a policy that was restricting the resource type, it was still applying and flagging it, so it hadn't fully been deleted or hadn't processed. I don't know, but I'm not really mad that example came up in the middle of the video because it's kind of good to know. But for now, if I check on why my validation failed, and I go to my raw error, it says disallowed by policy, and it says the reason TLS version must be 1.2. So our assignment's blocking this because the TLS version is not 1.2, exactly like we expect to. All right, so that policy is in place. It's preventing our storage accounts from being created. Rather than fixing that, let's instead, for our custom policy object, go ahead and write a policy to modify the TLS settings on storage accounts to be 1.2, and we'll see how that works. So I'm going to create a policy definition, and the first thing it's going to ask me for is the definition location. Now, in the very first video in the series, we were talking about Azure Platform, and I mentioned every Azure policy has to be stored in a management group, and it's only going to be available to resources underneath that management group, meaning resource group subscriptions or other management groups that are underneath the management group you stored in. So if you have two management groups that are side to side to each other, meaning one's not nested in each other, they're just equivalent, and you store a policy over here, that policy is not going to be available to be used by your management group on this side. So they have to be under a nested one. So that's also why I say multiple times, create a tenant root management group that you control and that you own, because you'll notice you can't assign policies to the tenant root group by default. So we're going to select that. Skip the description, go to name, fix our typo, and we're going to use an existing category because this is for storage accounts. All right. So when you're creating policies, it's got a bunch of information there, populated kind of by default. I don't know where it gets this information, but if I wanted to, I could import a sample definition straight from the Azure Policy GitHub repo. I've actually got one kind of filled, but rather than do that, let's go back to policies in this other tab and look at our minimum TLS storage policy. Because we know, because we just applied this policy and it selected everything correctly and it has the settings we already want to check for, we can go ahead and copy the rules from this because this is a good starting template. So for the if statement, let's just highlight this. If I collapse it, I know I've got the whole thing highlighted. Copy, come back over here, and paste. Now our selector is good. But there's some other element, and I'm not really a fan of this, but they put the parameters at the bottom. That's not how any other policy is written. So I'm going to move that up. Clean this up. Okay. So for policy definitions, there's really three important pieces to it. There's the parameters, and then there's the rules, and then for modified policies there is the role permissions, which we'll get to. But there's also all that other meta information that's on the top of a definition. So like, sorry, these multiple tabs mess up. All of this information here, right? That's included in the policy. But when you're writing it in the portal, you only have these friendly fields to work with. Now, something I'll call out. A policy object has a name attribute. By default, all the built-in policies have a GUID assigned to them, and that's their name. But if I try and specify a name here, it says property name is not allowed. It's doing that for you. I'm calling this out because if you use infrastructure as code, you can set the name yourself, meaning you can name your custom policies friendly, and it makes it a lot easier for referencing policies from an initiative because you have a friendly name versus just a GUID that you have to look up every time. So I just want to call it out. But all of the other information is up here as far as the name and description and everything. But this mode here references, it's basically a switch. There's two settings. It's either all, meaning this policy should evaluate every single type of resource that's created, or there's a property called indexed. Indexed means it's kind of nuanced, but essentially it means only values that, or only resources that can have tags applied are indexed. Management group would not fall into this. Permissions wouldn't fall into this, stuff like that. So generally speaking, use indexed if for most resource types, but use all if you need to. I've ran into one instance where I didn't have it set correctly and I couldn't get the policy to apply. It took me a long time to figure out why. Okay, so we've got our mode. I copied the if statement from that other template, but there's also these parameters. Now, this parameter is not going to be used, right? It's nothing to do with location. So let's clear that out. And what do I want to use for parameters? Well, the one thing we always have to use is effect, because that tells us what the policy is doing. In this case, this is not going to be an audit policy. This is going to be a modify policy because we want to actually fix this to update the setting if it's not set. So I'm going to change this to modify, and I'm going to change this to deny. And I deleted the default value, but I actually want this set. So copy this back, and I'm going to set this to modify. What this is doing is setting the effect on the policy to modify, and then setting the default value to modify, so this is now a modify policy. The other parameter we want to include is what do we want to actually set the minimum TLS version to. We know this is probably going to be 1.2, but to match our policy, but we want to make it a parameter so we can make this policy more usable and reusable in case of other situations. So if it's possible, we'll set the parameter. In this case, it's not going to be a minimum. It's going to be the actual TLS version we're configuring on the device. So I'm just going to get rid of minimum here. And those are my allowed values. That corresponds to the JSON data value that needs to be in that parameter, and default is 1.2 because that's what we want it to set to. Okay, so we have our parameters, which is going to be effect and TLS version. When we assign the policy, then we could set that, and then we have the rule. This is the what you can call the resource selector. So any resource that meets this rule is then going to trigger the then effect. So we copy this from this storage account definition, but just to go over what it's doing, type storage account, that's what we want, and then if either one of these is true, because it's an any of field, if either one of these is true, it's going to trigger then. So if the minimum TLS version property does not equal our TLS version parameter, and that's the name of this, so if it's not equal to TLS12, then we're going to trigger then. And then finally, if it doesn't exist, meaning that property doesn't exist, I also want to trigger the then material, because if it doesn't exist, I want to make sure it's set to what I want it to be. So if it doesn't exist, or if it's not set correctly, we're going to trigger the effect. Now, this is not going to have an effect because this is an audit policy, so there's not much for it to do under then. So what we're going to have to do here is go back to definitions, and I want to look at a modify policy, which is going to be this one. You can tell it's modified because of the allowed values. I also can tell it's modified because the title of it is configure, meaning this is actually changing a setting on the storage account. So I'm going to go down here, I'm going to skip the if statement because I don't care, and then I'm going to copy the effects down here. Go back, and we'll paste. Okay. So our effect is going to be a modifier because we're getting that from the parameter. I'm not going to get into conflict effect. We're going to skip the role definition ID for a second, and I'll get back to that because that's the other big component that you need to be aware of. And the operations is the actual change that it's going to make. Now, I don't care about the API version. You can map that back to the ARM template API if you want to, if it's not working, but generally speaking, we can leave that. The operation we want to do is add or replace, meaning if that parameter is missing, add it. If it's not what we want it to be, replace it. And then we specify the actual field that needs to get changed. If I pull this JSON back up, I can just copy the property directly from this. Copy and change that to that. And then I know what I want the value to be, which is going to be my parameter value, because this is what it's checking for. If it doesn't match, that doesn't work. So rather than type that in manually, what I actually want to do is set the parameter to my TLS version. There you go. So that's my then. So if it's not set correctly or if it's missing, then add or replace this property with this parameter and we're good to go. And this should be it. Okay. So that's the important parts of a policy definition structure. You have the parameters, your inputs that you're specifying. You have your rules broken down to if, which is your selector statement, and then, which is the actual property you're changing. Or if it's an audit or deny policy, you don't really have a then. The selector statement is just checking whether that setting is correct. And then the last piece here is this role definition. Now, this only applies on modify policies or deploy if not exists. And the reason for that is these policies are actually changing things on the resource. In Azure, you cannot change settings on a resource unless you have permissions to change things on the resource. So because modify or deploy if not exist policies are changing resources, it needs permissions in your portal to do that, and it needs to know what permissions that it needs. Now, in this case, it's got a GUID here for the role, right? If I want to look up what role this is, I can copy this, go back to my resource group or any IAM tab. In this case, I'm going to do my lab resource group. This will work from subscriptions, anywhere you can see this tab, and then go to roles, and you'll see a definition of all the roles that are available, and I can just paste that ID in here, and it tells me that's storage account contributor. So this role does have permissions to modify storage account properties, so this will be just fine. The other place I can see that if I'm doing it from the portal is on the bottom here on this role definitions, and I can select the name versus the ID. And if I were to check a different one or check a new one, it modifies this to add that role that I selected. So it's easier in the portal, but if you're doing it by code, you want to know how to look up roles, that's how you do it. And that's it. So this should work just fine. So let's go ahead and save this. And then assign it. We're going to do enforce because we want to make changes. Next, next. You notice my parameter is already set correctly, so I don't need to do anything. I'll leave that as default. Next. And then this is the tab we skipped with the last one because the deny policy doesn't need it. But what this is doing is specifying what is the identity you are using for the policy in order to make that change. Like I said, you assign the role because it needs permissions. It also needs an identity that's given that permissions that it can use to make those changes. So you have two options. You can use a user assigned managed identity, meaning you create a managed identity object, you grant that object permissions, and then you come in here and you can select it and specify it. And that gives you a little more control over the naming and everything else. Otherwise, where possible, it's always recommended to use system assigned managed identities. This is an identity that's then tied to the resource that's using it. If that resource goes away, the identity goes away, and then you don't have to manage or clean anything up afterwards. So this is always preferable, but we're going to talk about the problem with this in a little bit. But I always say use system assigned when possible. We're going to use it here too. And then it's going to create that identity, so you have to specify location. I always default to whatever your favorite location is, and it tells you the role that it's going to grant that as well. So that's this tab, what we skipped over last time. It is needed here because it's a modify activity. So next, on the flip side, for a deny policy, it's going to be blocking someone from making a resource. For a modify policy, it's not going to be blocking anything. It's just changing a resource. So they're never going to see a non-compliance message because the property that you need is just changed. So you can skip this if it's only a modify assignment. Next, create. All right, our policy is created. So just like last time, let's go back and create a resource, a storage account that doesn't meet our policy. Random stuff here. Still getting that residual error too about the resource type. So I'm hoping we don't have to monkey with it too much. Next, we're going to set our TLS version to 1.0 because we require 1.2 and we want this to trigger our policy. Next, next. Okay. This is not found. I'm just going to click around and hopefully I can trigger this. There we go. All right. Just had to click a couple times. Okay, so this is saying we're creating it with TLS 1.0. Now, remember last time we had the screen, before we made our configure policy, it blocked us right here with that same banner. It said validation failed. You clicked on it, it said not allowed by policy, TLS 1.2 is required. In this case, I have 1.0 selected, but it's still allowing me to create. So if I create this resource, it creates my deployment, pulls up the resource, and it allowed it to go through. I'm not being blocked. So let's let this complete and then take a look at the resource itself. All right, says it was successful. So let's click here, refresh a couple of times. Got our new storage account with its lovely name. And if I go back and look at configuration, you can see our TLS version is now 1.2, meaning it was updated correctly according to our modified policy. Lastly, if I go here and pull up the JSON values for this, let me switch to my better camera here. Our minimum TLS version 1.2. So our policy applied, it updated the values. I will look at logs here in a second, but I'm trying to give them a second to populate. So let's look at one other element before we go back here. So I'm in my resource group thing. I mentioned about the system assigned managed identity and a caveat with that. Also the role definition ID. If I go to my IAM tab and look at my role assignments here and scroll down, two things. Storage account contributor, remember this is the role that we assigned to that policy. And the policy itself said it was going to configure that role. But I have this random character number combination thing that's not really helpful to others. I also have an identity not found policy, which drives me nuts. These are both going back to the Azure policy we configured. This is from earlier when I was doing this myself, running through this lab demo. And then this is the policy we just assigned. I'm not really sure if it's even possible to track this down, like what's assigning it, without knowing firsthand. So if I click into this, it takes me to intro. No owners, It's nothing, right? It's an ID that links back to nothing, and it's hard. If I didn't know myself that I just created a policy that granted this role, I would be looking at this wondering, what is this random character number combination and why does it exist here? And this is one of the major drawbacks of creating policies with the portal, is this nonsense right here. Also, the fact that I deleted a previous policy that was doing the same thing, and rather than cleaning up this entry, it just gave me this identity not found, this basically abandoned identity that's assigned the same permissions. So there are some caveats with assigning Azure policies with a modify action and system assigned managed identity, meaning they don't clean themselves up and it can be difficult to find them. If you use a code-based solution for deploying policies, either an IAC solution or enterprise policy as code, you can name the assignment. It's a 24 character limit, but then you name the assignment and the assignment name will show up in this role instead of a random name. The alternative is, if you're using the portal, I actually preferred on any remediation or any policy that used a modify action to go ahead and create a user assigned managed identity so that I could name it, and that way I'd specify the user assigned managed identity I was using, and that made the IAM page, the role assignment page, a lot more obvious as to what that role is and where it's coming from, being an Azure policy thing. So I wanted to specifically call that out here. Okay, so I don't know if it'll populate yet, but I'm in my resource group. That policy made changes. If I didn't know and wasn't expecting that policy made changes, it's very possible, if I'm a developer that's deploying resources, that I wouldn't realize an attribute that I just set up was changed, because it wasn't obvious anything changed. I got no warning messages. I got no policy notifications that said a resource was changed. It just changed it and then passed my deny policy. The only place that it leaves a record of these policy changes, unless you have something else configured, is under the activity log here for either the resource group or the subscription. Now, it said 4 minutes ago, so I'm hoping this will show right here. Okay, so this tab shows all policy actions that have happened on this resource group lately, and you can see everything that I've done in the lab videos up until this point with deny, validates, create policy assignments. It all shows up in the activity log here. This is why activity logs are kind of a good thing to store from an audit perspective, because it does show this stuff. But if I click on modify, this shows the resource is that random storage account that was modified, and then it has a JSON value here. Let me see if I can see what's. And then you see under policies, it's got listed what policies apply. And then right here, add or replace minimum TLS version right there. So it's still really hard to interpret what's going on here. But if I'm looking for a record of policy changes that have taken place, you can show the changes listed in this activity log. It does take some parsing. There's also other ways you can set up event-driven notifications, but that's more advanced, and I'll probably get into that in a different topic. But that is policy definitions in a nutshell. We talked about, I'm going to pull up our policy just so we can look at it as I'm recapping here. We wrote a custom policy. We talked about the important things, which are like, we talked about the kind of meta attributes here, right? Name, mode. We talked about the importance of parameters as far as your effects or other inputs that you might want to customize. It's always good to use parameters, even if it's a value you're specifying as default and not planning on changing it. Just gives you more flexibility long term. And then we talked about the rules. The if statement being your resource selector and how you're evaluating compliance, and in the case of audit or deny policies, everything is basically an if statement. And then if you're using a modify policy, the then statement is where you actually define what's changing and what roles are required to make that policy change. And that is our overview of policy definitions. Now, I was going to spend some extra time here. Hold on. Talking about why you want to manage policy with infrastructure as code solutions. I've already mentioned this a couple of times. I'm going to put a link in the description of this video for our enterprise policy as code, which is the Microsoft solution for doing this. But you have a lot more flexibility on managing policy attributes and resources if you're using an infrastructure as code solution to deploy them rather than using the portal. It makes assignments easier, it makes scalability way easier, it makes it so you can name assignments so that if you're doing permissions, it'll show up with a friendly name versus some generated name for you. It makes visibility way easier. You can manage exemptions and assignments, sets, definitions all in one place. There's every reason to use policy as code. So I want to specifically call out there is every reason to do it, and the only reason you wouldn't is if you're doing a very small scale deployment. That's been the topic. Like I said, I think I'm probably going to do a whole series of advanced Azure policy management because it's something that I've spent a lot of time doing and it's difficult, and I wouldn't mind recapping some of that information and sharing what I've learned so far and going over some of the EPAC deployment stuff that we've done in our environment too. So that might be coming in the future. For now, this has been our overview. If you do have questions or things that I could clarify, feel free to leave a comment on the video, and then I might just make another addendum video later. We're going over some of the stuff because I realize I'm coming from a perspective of a lot of experience with this, but this is a really complicated subject, and it's oftentimes foreign to people, so it might be difficult to wrap your head around. But that's that. Thanks for listening. I'll see you later.